TikTok gave me autism, the politics of self-diagnosis. Not sure who Alexander Avila is. I'm not sure what their stance on it, so I'm as blind as you are going into this, but I will not be afraid to share my own personal opinions, thoughts on these things. I think there's going to be about 3 different separate reasons that they give, or talking points that they're going to talk on, so let's get into it.
So I was sitting in a car with a friend a few years ago. I wasn't driving because I'm gay, but we took one of those aimless afternoon drives where you talk about life and shit, you know? And I said, you know, man, sometimes it feels like life is like, I don't know, a series of scripts, and I'm just like trying to build those scripts from scratch while everyone else is off book. And he turns to me and says, you know, that's literally a symptom of autism. And, you know, I didn't know if he knew what he was talking about, but I just said to him, well, I wouldn't be surprised.
So I've been told that this is TikTok, and that I'm also supposed to hate it because it's supposedly giving the youth transsexual autism. And you know what? That upsets me, because that's my job. But others seem to be upset at the fact that suddenly an alleged millions of youths are logging onto TikTok, self-diagnosing themselves with conditions like autism, ADHD, depression, and anxiety, destroying traditional psychiatric knowledge, and using their awe-inspired power to dictate who lives and who dies.
I don't care what anyone says. There is a trend of people who are not autistic diagnosing themselves as autistic, as well as having ADHD on TikTok. I think it's an attempt to explain their...
I'm laughing because it's like... This is like the overreaction that people have when they think about self-diagnosis. It's like this evil thing. It's going to destroy people, destroy people's lives. And for the majority of people who are, you know, sound of mind at an appropriate age, you know, I feel, you know, there's a lot to be said for individuals who have done their research and who really understand it, who have talked to other autistic people, really developed, challenged themselves. And I find that most people that I come across who say that they're self-diagnosed, they're often quite humble about it, as in, like, for definite, they'll be like, oh, I'm not too sure. I think I'm autistic, you know. They still have that air of not really knowing. And if they do know, and they do say that, they've usually done like gone through a whole bunch of different stages of like imposter syndrome and, you know, trying to figure out whether it's something that they should talk about, whether it's pulling attention away from people who are diagnosed. You know, there's so many different things involved in it.
Behavior to themselves, even if it is subconscious. I think it's the most stupid and annoying thing to do. I see countless TikToks of autistic traits and ADHD traits, which are perfectly fine as they do have their own traits, but so many people seem to just be self-diagnosing because they're like, oh, I do that. And I think that takes away the space for people who actually have autism or ADHD. Self-diagnosing something like that is cringe and makes you look like you're just trying to find your space and explain why you're different. Everyone's different.
And this is another thing. People think that it's the fashion. Like these people who are criticizing self-diagnosed individuals, they think it's a fashion. Like it's something cool, quirky. Like the label of being autistic isn't something that's always looked upon favorably in pretty much most instances that I've been through in my life, other than doing autism advocacy and making videos on autism. It's pretty often something that either makes people just kind of go, you know, not think I'm being serious, or just actively like, that's weird and stay away from me kind of thing. So it's a very strange thing to say. I understand the thoughts behind it, but you know, I'm an autistic person, and I don't feel like people are encroaching on my identity if they're self-diagnosing. It's just not really the way that my brain works, to be honest.
With or without these things.
And I agree. How dare these people find a space to exchange similar experiences of difference? But is this version how self-diagnosis usually happens? So fine, I'll admit it. I've turned to self-diagnosis in the past. From the age of 11 years old, I've suspected that I'm autistic. Over the past decade, I've read tons of different pieces of writing from neurodivergent people. I've read theories about mental disorders, diagnostic criteria, and in times of stress, I sometimes turn to autistic communities online because it helps. I don't know where else I can find people that understands the social alienation and confusion in being unable to navigate social norms, or why I'll neglect basic bodily functions when I'm in hyperfocus, or why I have a callus on my hand from decades of doing, I don't even know what this is. It's the good stuff. That's good. You want to take a hit? It's kind of like an autistic double life. And hey, there are worse vices. Is it super neurotypical to relate so deeply with autistic experience and narrative? I don't know. Maybe I was indoctrinated into autism the same way postmodern neo-Marxists indoctrinated me into being a homoerotic transgender. A sociology degree will do that to a guy. I don't have a...
This man has some, the humor, the tongue-in-cheek humor, it's just getting to me. Oh my god. Okay, continue. You speaking some truth here.
A diagnosis or anything, but it feels like after all this time of resonating with the experiences of people with autism, there's probably a really good chance that I have autism. Also, my brother was diagnosed with autism, so I know those autistic genes are floating around in here somewhere. I suspect that most people who self-diagnose their neurodivergence have similar stories to mine. They grow up feeling different, they don't have the resources to seek a professional diagnosis, and so they go about their lives, finding labels and communities that help them make sense of their experiences.
And it's not something that's just done in the moment, like people are saying. Sure, people comment, they say, oh, I might be autistic, oh, I guess I'm autistic now. That's not always just a complete depiction of their thoughts and feelings wholly. That might just be an in the moment thing and then they forget about it. What we're trying to do with these videos of oh, here are the traits, is to open people's minds to the possibility that they could be autistic. It's not to convert people into more people who say that they're autistic in some kind of weird cult-like fashion. Because that's the way that it kind of comes across with these posts, It's really demeaning to the intelligence and how much people want to understand themselves. It's not a blasé kind of oh, I want this, I'm going to be called this. Oh, everyone's wearing the latest turtleneck, or I'm going to start wearing turtlenecks. Oh, people are saying they're autistic, oh, I better jump on that train. Get out of here.
You'd think that the argument here is straightforward. Maybe people don't have the psychiatric expertise, but if they're not hurting anyone, there's no harm in letting people explore autism in the privacy of their own backyard, right? But the answer isn't really all that clear. Online opinion havers have given the conversation frustratingly high stakes.
Me explaining to people that a lot of white extreme leftist allies need multiple self-diagnosed neurodivergent and queer labels because they have an excessive want to relate to BIPOC, and they're looking for reasons to be oppressed because they can't stand the idea of being a privileged white person and need to be a victim of at least one thing at all times, and how these type of people are actually insufferable and the worst, but since they're technically politically correct, people tend to like them, and a lot, even though it's all performative as fuck.
Yeah. Okay. That's an...
I've had some people like that comment on my stuff in the past. Seriously, it's or people within my own life where I've told them that I'm autistic, and they'll say, oh yeah, but you're white and straight, as if it just reduces all of the pain that I've had to go through in life and the difference. Sure, it's a factor that's involved in someone's life experiences, but it's not this weird way of worming into understand into certain in groups. It doesn't. Yeah, it's a really weird way of thinking about it.
Opinion. Many of you probably had a gut reaction to it, but let's sit with it for a second. Is there a small part of you that agrees with it? Or is that just the IBS? Is there a part of you that kind of sees the original TikToker's point? Or perhaps you have other concerns? Like if it were to come between a diagnosed person and an undiagnosed person seeking resources, who would you choose and why? What do you think has more claims to certain resources? Before we answer that, let me sit to create some drama.
Question.
The answer is complicated and perhaps not as pertinent to the larger question. Instead, I want to focus on the real meat of the conversation. I want to examine something that underlies why you may or may not have a gut reaction to self-diagnosis. Because sure, there are probably 14-year-olds on this earth who frivolously take on serious labels. But I don't think the object of our focus, especially politically, should be 14-year-olds or even white Twitter leftists. Because no one is talking about the millions, maybe even billions of people who have strong hesitations against self-diagnosis because they all have one thing in common. They believe that psychiatric institutions have the final authority to dictate reality. For now, I'm not going to say whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. First, because the answer probably isn't that simple and
it's not that simple. Because autism is diagnosed through traits, psychological signs, symptoms. Don't like that word. That means that there is a human who has to give you that diagnosis, that label. And a lot of the time, people have their own biases on what they consider to be autism that don't always necessarily line up with the actual criteria. It sounds silly saying that, but it's true. Some people have got some diagnosticians, some people who are autism experts who I had therapy for at university. They just knew absolutely nothing about understanding and interacting with autistic people, and it's a bit crazy. You'd like to think that it is flawless, but it's not. And even if it is done well, most psychiatric diagnoses, that whether they're considered to be a diagnosis or not is dependent on what percentage of diagnosticians can accurately tell that someone has a diagnosis. So, for example, with depression, it's pretty low. I can't remember the exact percentage. It might be about 60% accuracy rate when it comes to diagnosing depression, which is a lot lower than most people would think. And it's pretty, it's the same with autism. It's not always accurately diagnosed, and it's a very, very wide thing, and it covers a lot of different things. A lot of people have different presentations. You have masking, you have internalized ableism in the mix. There's so many different cultural, environmental factors that go into that. And so it's not always this flawless thing, which is, I come from a scientific background. I'm aware, of why it's important to do things by certain standards and things like that. But given the lack of autism education, the amount of research that we've done into it, I don't feel like it's a flawless thing at the moment. And that's one of the reasons why I am for self-diagnosis. It's not the only reason, but it is definitely one of the reasons.
Second, because I'm not here to make strong moral judgments. Instead, I'm going to give you 3 takes on self-diagnosis and mental conditions, especially focusing on the case of autism because it's the case that I'm most familiar with. I agree with all of the following takes in different ways, but I'm not exactly sure where I stand. Maybe you can help me out. Please keep in mind that I do not claim to represent the experiences or voices of all neurodivergent people. This whole thing is just the opinion of one effeminate man with a camera and a bachelor's degree that's at best 75% legitimate. I might bring up some ideas that seem kind of strange, maybe even offensive. You don't have to agree with me, but I hope I'll at least have made you reflect on why you believe the things that you do. And hey, at least you believe in something.
Go for it, man. Set your stage, I'm definitely not in the all I'm within the autistic community, I have to agree with everything that most people agree with. There's nuance to it. There's opinions, you know, even within the autistic community. It's just that some voices are a little bit louder than others. Okay, first one, level 1. Self-diagnosis is super duper valid. Let's see what he has to say about this.
Some people adamantly declare that you can't claim a neurodivergent identity unless you have a diagnosis. Someone like me needs a diagnosis for a mental condition, as if authoring a 40,000-word gay Beatles fanfiction wasn't indication enough. Well played, some people. Maybe these some people are right. If these self-diagnosers are so neurodivergent, why can't they neurodiverge themselves back to their local neuropsychologist's office and get some of that reasonably priced diagnostic testing? Let's look at a few of the reasons why someone might not want to seek a formal autism diagnosis. Let's get the big book of autism out. First, according to my notes, a diagnosis for any mental health condition is expensive. Even in Joe Biden's communist regime. The average price for an autism full evaluation is about $1,000 to $2,000, but
Yep.
I'm sure it's extremely easy to find someone who takes your insurance. Second, it seems that many mental health professionals have different types of training and may subscribe to biased conceptions of what autism is. Conceptions
Yes.
that are outdated or
Yes.
empirically unproven and rejected by neurodivergent literature. There's tons of stories of people going in for an autism diagnosis who get rejected and dismissed by mental health professionals because they made too much eye contact or they're too good at conversation. The scholarship also consistently finds that women and people of color tend to be underdiagnosed with conditions like autism and ADHD because nearly everything science knows and believes about autism is about how it's been studied in rich white boys. But mental health professionals and institutions are unbiased and objective measures of personal experience, right? Right. And finally, a diagnosis for a mental health condition isn't always beneficial. You may have noticed that there's kind of a stigma associated with mental health, and not everyone wants to carry the stigma and weight associated with this stigmatized label.
It's not related to mental health. It's not a mental condition. It's a neurodevelopmental thing, which it related to the brain, but neurodevelopmental. You're born with it.
Isn't super necessary to have that label, especially. It can interfere with your life in ways you don't expect. For example, have you ever thought about immigrating to New Zealand? Where's the shit? Is it this? Whatever, it's not a real country. Well, an autism diagnosis pretty much bans you from becoming a citizen.
Yes.
Even if immigrating to Poopeeland isn't on your to-do list, there's still plenty of other ways a diagnosis might impact your life. Some people's applications to adopt children gets denied because of their diagnosis. Others have had custody of their children threatened because of the whole stigma thing. There's this unfounded assumption that people with diagnosed disabilities or conditions inherently don't have autonomy to care for themselves or others. Yet, the infantilization of disabled and diagnosed people continues. States like Missouri are trying to restrict gender-affirming care for those diagnosed with autism. Maybe adopting a child, moving to New Zealand, or transing your gender weren't on the top of your GCal, but these are just some of the ways a formal diagnosis might not always lead to the best outcomes. Wherever you stand, I think we should at least agree that even if someone doesn't have a formal diagnosis, they have a right to access the accommodations that allow them to live a decent life.
They have the right to, and it should very much be that. However, when talking in the context of work in the US, you will find, if you look at the government recommendations for reasonable adjustments, that finding some ulterior way to fire your autistic employee is a reasonable adjustment, apparently. Don't think it's the same in the UK. Not to say that people in the UK, businesses in the UK don't do that, because I'm pretty sure they definitely do. It'll be something like, you're not the right fit for the team. You just don't seem to be getting on well. It's nothing to do with your autism, something that influences how you socialize and communicate with people at all. Nothing to do with that. It's just some random out of the box reason. And that's something that I've become acutely aware of from, encouraging people to seek reasonable adjustments. Sometimes going and asking for reasonable adjustments, they'll give you it because they don't want to look bad, but then they will find some reason to fire you. So it's not as clear cut as, they should give you them, and so they will give you them, and everything will be rosy and good. Life can be very complicated, and it is very dependent on the type of organization that you're working for. We'd like to live in a world where reasonable adjustments, self-advocacy is real, and it works. Often it doesn't. You just have to look at like the employment statistics around autism to see that. It's really unfortunate.
We know the institution is biased, and we shouldn't let those biases get in the way of people's legitimate needs.
And also, I just want to say this about the white people TikTok. I'm not saying that there can't be an element of truth to this statement. There are people who cling to certain marginalized labels to deflect from their privilege. But acknowledging that fact shouldn't lead us towards suspicion or hostility against individuals
100%.
that claim to have certain conditions or identities. Because I think it's even more infuriating when someone uses this pseudo-leftist language to justify some weird moral authority over someone's identity. And hey, I get it, dunking on people is fun. It's even more fun when it feels like your dunking contributes to a movement for social justice. Orange man bad, right? But oftentimes this rhetoric against self-diagnosis or self-identification specifically doesn't come from a place of empathy for marginalized people. It often comes from the very human and very understandable desire to dunk. The answer that I offer might be less satisfying to those who want to feel good about dunking on annoying people, but I think it's what's right. And here it is. Everyone must be aware of the multiple intersections they occupy and take steps to ensure they're not using their privileges to harm underprivileged groups. And that means no dunking, no suspicion over people for claiming a marginalized identity, and no using your identity to deflect responsibility for the shit that you do.
Yes.
Is that good? Okay, we got it? Cool. All right. What was I talking about?
Okay, well, even if psychiatrists and psychiatric institutions are biased, that clinical expertise far surpasses the average assessment of the average Joe Schmo, or John Doe, right? Because the psychiatrist knows, right? They know the truth. They know how to be more objective than us, right? They know.
They're some special human being. They're all powerful. Nah, it's not always the case. It's a pointer in some level of expertise. It's not always correct. It's like, I don't know, you only have to go on YouTube and look up like fitness and stuff to realize that some PTs, some personal trainers, have just manifold levels more of an understanding about exercise science than some professors or doctors even, and like how to apply that practically. It's a string to your bow. It's some level of recognition, but it's not everything. Mia says I was subjected to a 10-year hate campaign for trying to get reasonable adjustments at airports. God damn it. I'm so sorry to hear that, Mia. Yeah, that's tough. And at airports as well. Why? I don't understand why people would start a hate campaign over that. Just trying to have access to things.
Only they know.
Mental illness is a social construct.
Just because something is a social construct doesn't mean that it isn't real. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have serious effects on lived experience, or that it doesn't have a material foundation. Money is a social construct. Yet money also impacts us on an internal, psychological level. That hurt. People throw away their lives chasing big wins. And of course, money has an external material reality. It practically organizes the world. A $20,000 family and a $200,000 family live completely different lives, in zip codes with totally different communities, schools, doctors, and even food options. So money is real, but it's also something humans created.
Yep.
Now, I may not be a psychiatrist, but I am a mind reader, and I know what you're thinking. Money and mental conditions are totally different things, Alex. Money comes from the outside world, and mental conditions come from the internal brain. You can't socially construct things that come from the freaking brain. Just because a given set of experiences are internally emergent doesn't mean that the ways we categorize and understand those experiences can't be socially constructed.
100%. And this is one of the issues that we have around autism and ADHD at the moment, because some of the traits, some of the presentations, they have a very big crossover with each other. I mean, just going off the co-occurring conditions, I think if you're autistic, it's like it could be the opposite way around, like a 70% chance that you could be the other one. Very, very highly tied together, like as far as like things go. Sometimes very different. I have come across people who are just ADHD, who I can tell that they're not autistic and they don't have those autistic traits to them. I've come across ADHDers. I can see the autism there, I can see the ADHD there. But again, like it all depends on how you want to characterize something, what boundaries that you want to put around something in order to call it something. So I think that's where Alexander is coming from here.
Because to understand internal experiences, we always have to put those experiences into words. We have to label those experiences and draw boundaries around certain experiences to differentiate them from other experiences. Social theorists Berger and Luckman argue that social construction doesn't mean that something isn't real or doesn't exist. Instead, social construction refers to the idea that things in the world, like a shoe, a ball, or the fraud you committed on your 2022 tax returns, aren't things totally independent of the ways we discuss and label these things. Reality as we know it and understand it is constructed through us talking about reality, labeling reality, and categorizing objects in reality. We don't have access to the world as it really is. Just look at the goddamn spectrum of light. Actually, you can't, you bonehead. Do you know how much of this we can actually see? This little gay piece right here. We can't even see the shit that's right in front of us. As humans, we've come to know reality through language and social exchange. Through people telling us that red is red and blue is blue. It's all we have. Reality itself is socially constructed. But this all seems so abstract. How can mental illness be a social construct? Isn't it a set of chemicals that does things and makes you listen to Elliott Smith? Well, let's look at the history of psychiatry and think about what people mean when they say mental illness is socially constructed. If I presented you all with the words reason and madness and asked you to describe the relationship between these two ideas, you might say that reason and madness are opposites. Madness and reason are inherently opposed, or are they? Have madness and reason always been contrasting concepts, understood as opposites throughout time?
You can have a method to your madness. Maybe you can reason your madness. Reality would be a better contrast. I don't know.
Or is that
Enlighten me.
dichotomy actually a recent invention? Let's do a little Western culture throwback, but not like in a weird fascist way. In the Middle Ages, mental illness was not seen as a medical pathology, but as a madness that constituted a legitimate form of knowledge. What does that mean? Is it good or bad? Well, that requires a bit of light reading. Michel Foucault was a guy with ideas. Some of those ideas were sus and mid and cringe, while others went on to influence the entire disciplines of sociology, philosophy, literary theory, anthropology, feminism, critical theory, basically any field where homosexuals reign supreme. In his highly influential work, Madness and Civilization, Foucault argues that mental illness and disorder, which he calls madness, is a historically changing social construct. He uses the word mad to describe what we today call mental illness, so when I use the term mad, I don't mean it as a bad word. Think of madness as a group of behaviors and experiences that eventually become the category of what we call mental illness, mental disorder, and so on. So, in Madness and Civilization, Foucault traces the history of the category of madness to emphasize this idea that contemporary Western categories and knowledges aren't universal God-given systems of perfection, but historical social products. And from all the examples and historical documents he brings up, there's this underlying radical idea that contemporary medical pathology is just one of many flawed ways of organizing the knowledge we have about and from those that society declares mad.
Yes, it's like a comparison between the majority and the minority of people who are different.
So there's this thing that Foucault calls the modern period. Basically, right now-ish. And like I said earlier, in this modern period, madness and reason are two opposite concepts. This wasn't always the case. Back in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, madness wasn't considered an innate flaw that belonged to an individual's nature. In some Middle-Age Christian contexts, portions of society considered madness to be a divine deliverance, revered by religious institutions as a sign of one's devotion to God and esoteric Christian knowledge. In the Renaissance, we see depictions of madness in literature as a source of knowledge, where mad characters would reveal truths about society and the future. For example, in one of the Shakespeare plays that isn't a metaphor for gay sex, King Lear, the titular character's madness provides insight into King Lear's flaws. King Lear's madness isn't understood as a biological condition of the mind, but a condition of fate and spirit that people in the Renaissance could identify with in their paradigm of madness. It's not that those considered mad were treated well in the Middle Ages. It wasn't exactly a positive attribute. But madness was understood through a different paradigm. Though madness wasn't considered an appropriate state of being, madness wasn't understood as mental illness or as a fundamental biological nature as it is today. Foucault describes that
madness fascinates because it is knowledge. It is knowledge first because all these absurd figures are, in reality, elements of a difficult, hermetic, esoteric learning.
The point isn't to say that people in the Middle Ages were stupid idiots just waiting for epic Reddit science to come save them from their ignorance. Nor is this a call to return to these centuries-old rules of propriety. The point is to highlight the changing relationship between knowledge and madness, or in other words, between knowledge and marginalized people. Foucault wants to highlight the idea that knowledge isn't about the search for an eternal truth, but that society's ideas of legitimate or worthy knowledge are products of a culture's system of power.
That's a very, very interesting way of putting it. It's like, it's divergent thinkers. I suppose in some contexts, things that people put forwards, some eras, sometimes like in human history, some things that people put forwards would be seen as stupid or ridiculous, but some things that we put forward in the modern day might not be. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting take, although I wouldn't categorize madness as autism, because quite often autistic people usually have very well-constructed opinions on things from my experience that tend to follow more of the reason than madness, just from my experience, but it's not necessarily something that people accept because it goes against what, like, the common vein of what people perceive to be right or normal, or which I think is maybe that's where Alexander is coming from. Let's see though. I'm hesitant to like continue watching because I'm like really interested in learning, because bringing up some stuff that I haven't particularly come across before, but also like I need to offer my own commentary on things as well.
Does anyone else hear that?
One of the biggest problems in our society is...
I almost didn't expect that to be an advert, to be honest. I wouldn't put it past him to like put a fake advert in a video.
Oh, it's the 17th century. What's up, man? How you doing? Oh, and what do you have with you? Is that the ideological foundations of the modern human sciences? Yeah, never mind. No solicitors, babe. Okay, so you're not gonna believe this.
Fugay says, I've been around psychiatrists since my mid-20s, and some are idiots in my opinion. Mia says, I think there's always a reason for what we think. Even if we are wrong about something, it's still worth looking at what's behind our thoughts. Yeah, and it's also like, if you have a different way of thinking, perceiving, and processing the world and things, it's often a good talking point, and something to be delved into further. Sometimes it doesn't always apply, but sometimes it does. And, just having someone bring something new to the table can often be really, really useful. It could strengthen the ideas that people had already in place, but it could also offer a new way of looking at it, which might be a bit more helpful or, right, or makes more sense. It's one of the reasons why I think having a diversity of neurotypes within the workplace is so important. Do we have an inner wisdom? I don't know. I don't feel like I do. I kind of, for most of my life, I approached things very much machine-like, I guess, in trying to understand things. Like it's always come from a body of understanding things conceptually, rather than just feeling things or just going with what other people told me was right. You have to be careful with the idea of madness. It is often used as a label to discredit those people dislike. Yeah, I suppose so.
So around the 17th century, as the human sciences began to become a thing, there was a conceptual shift in how Western society viewed knowledge. Because of some weird society stuff, the concept of reason became this new, hot and sexy organizing principle of knowledge. In this new and wacky 17th century, things could only be considered knowledge if they met 17th century standards of reason, which I'm sure were super objective and evaluated by a super diverse group of people. Yep. Now that it's the 17th and 18th century, it went out of fashion to consider madness as a form of knowledge or divine revelation. Weird society stuff happened, and suddenly people started to view madness as a fundamental nature, an unreasonable nature. Let's look at the timeline. I mentioned earlier that in some Renaissance Christian contexts, madness could be interpreted as a type of divine godly revelation, or a type of knowledge. But around the 17th century, new paradigms reorganized the way institutions thought about knowledge, where now knowledge had to be derived from reason. Anyone who was anyone wanted to distinguish themselves as reasonable. And anyone who couldn't come off as reasonable basically was not. Those deemed in opposition to reason were dehumanized and written off as beings with fundamental natural flaws. These included groups like homosexuals, sex workers, the poor, basically anyone who knows how to have fun, and of course, the newly created category of the mentally ill. So madness went from a knowledge to a type of inherent unreason that emerges from an individual, from a revelatory knowledge to an inherent flawed nature.
Madness.
And a lot of this is like the idea of what's considered to be madness. It would be very dependent on the stances of the people in that time. It's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Thus torn from that imaginary freedom which still allowed it to flourish on the Renaissance horizon. Not so long ago it had floundered about in broad daylight in King Lear and Don Quixote, but in less than a half century it had been sequestered and in the fortress of confinement, bound to reason, to the rules of morality, and to their monotonous nights.
But Alex, says my framing device, knowledge is objective. It's true. It's firm. It's universal. But no, that's just the way our culture understands knowledge. Think about it. To create knowledge, a society needs to have paradigms for what it considers legitimate or correct knowledge.
Statistical
Society
significance.
needs ways of collectively deciding what it considers legitimate knowledge, and importantly, what gets excluded from legitimate knowledge. And while this seems obvious, the less obvious part is the history that we take for granted. Our rules for legitimate knowledge are historical social constructs. We like to think that knowledge production looks like a straight path towards an absolute truth, and that even if it veers off sometimes, it's all heading towards one thing. But that's not the way the world works, because What the hell is that thing? Who gets to decide what that thing is and why? It only looks like a straight path if we assume we're all heading towards the same destination. But we're not. We never are. And why do we even have to have a destination? Why can't we take the scenic route and do a little silly loop-de-loops? Historical and social processes determine the boundaries of this final destination we call truth. Modern Western reason isn't the end of history. It's just one quite limited paradigm for which to understand knowledge that excludes the experiences of a whole lot of people. And
I do get where they're coming from. I think it's a worthwhile like thing to consider. I do think that there are particular areas, when we start adding statistics into things, although it feels very cold and annoying. Science is based a lot on statistics, especially when it comes to biology, psychiatry, things like that. I think the thing that could be a little bit more of an interesting point is the stuff around psychiatry, because in order to classify something, you have to give it some traits. You have to like say, okay, these are the type of people that we're going to call this, which is a decision for someone to categorize. Like you could say that, smokers are, it's somewhat, they found some genes to do with smoking, so they're now the smoking psychological profile. It's a bad example, I'll give you. It's a terrible example, but you know what I mean. It's something that people decide that this is a thing. Truth is another word for dogma, in my opinion. I mean, I feel like truth can be relative. It depends in what context, and not all truths are more likely to be true than false. The whole thing about statistical significance, the thing with science is that when you take stuff in terms of mechanics, and you apply facts and knowledge into designing something, if it works, then it works. So it's kind of like, I do get what he's saying about it. It is that there are some areas of life where it's a little bit grey, I guess, certain fields where it's a bit more grey, especially stuff to do with understanding, sociology. That's a very grey area, I think. And very dependent on the culture that you do that statistical research in. So, there's lots of caveats to things. I do think that statistical significance and facts do exist, but I think that the way that we think about facts should change to some degree, I guess. Not just immediately writing someone off just because it doesn't fit in with a certain way of thinking. It's giving that person time to explain themselves. If it doesn't make sense, it's just one of the things. But it's interesting, like tying in like the social context, like the historical context into this. Let's see what else he has to say on this.
Can't emphasize this enough. Modern Western reason didn't get to the top of our society's hierarchy of knowledge because it's the perfect idea that beat out everyone in the free marketplace of ideas. The battle for knowledge production is often won through blood, conquest, and oppression. And because of that fact, there's radical scholars today trying to uplift discounted ways of knowing, like oral histories, spirituality, indigenous epistemologies, which all have unique qualities that Western reason can't account for. But that's another discussion. Let's talk mental illness. The 17th century was the beginning of what we might call the modern period. Around that time, we start to see new ideas about madness in institutions. As I said, the view of madness shifted from a knowledge to a type of fallen nature, an innocent animality. The mad were people who didn't meet the day's standards of reasonable humanity. But unlike the gays and the poor, according to society, the mad supposedly had no choice in their unreason, and so they were labeled innocent animals. By the time we get to the 18th and 19th century, the idea of madness as innocent animality becomes the modern concept of mental illness. The newly developed fields of human sciences like psychology and, to my shame, sociology, construct models of what they thought was proper human nature and conduct. Those who diverged from this path were othered. In this modern period, if your madness went against what was considered proper human conduct, you were declared to have biologically emergent flaws that could be objectively studied as mental illness. To these
interesting way of looking at this. Imagine a world where the neurotypical neurotype, don't know what else you would call it, you wouldn't call it neurotypical, you call autism neurotypical, where everybody had most people had the autistic neurotype, and that was the way that people did things, and that's the way that people interacted. They're very direct, less emotional expression, more emotional descriptions, explanations, more clarity, more, all of those kind of things. Perhaps the environment's less sensory provoking, perhaps the way that people socialize differs, the way that people market things, there's so many different things in this society. Perhaps that would be the norm, and so it wouldn't be classified as a difference. But being neurotypical, holistic rather, would be classified as being a difference. So it's very relative to what is considered to be the norm.
Early psychologists, mental illness was an unfortunate flaw that stripped a person of their humanness. These are the consequences of things like upholding reason. Well, according to the thoughts of some definitely not racist people who now underlie our entire modern legal framework for some reason, human beings are born with the capacity for reason. And that capacity for reason is what gives human beings the natural right to autonomy and self-determination. That means that the fight over who society considers reasonable and unreasonable takes on a lot of weight. If society equates reason with humanity, then we should pay attention to the way society and social groups define reason. And what if reason wasn't ever that hot to begin with, John? What if it's just a word that people use to exclude the oppressed from participating in society, John? Did you ever think of that, John? Did it ever cross your fucking mind, John? And if you're then called mentally ill and therefore have this flaw of innocent animality that takes away your humanity, then you don't have those natural rights to autonomy and self-determination anymore, do you? To be declared mentally ill is to be declared non-human. Now it's up to the psychiatric institution to help you reach your natural human state of reason.
Becoming normal. Normal. Oh my god. It's a bad truth, but yeah, it is true. You kind of have your autonomy taken off you if you are classified as being mentally ill to some degree. Although saying mental illness in the context of autism, it's not a mental illness, autism. So it doesn't really make sense in that way to talk about mental illness. I suppose back in the books, back in history, it would be classified as that.
Psychiatrists now had the ultimate authority over your humanity. In the essay Psychiatric Power, Foucault states,
"Now, what is essentially involved in these power relations was the absolute right of non-madness over madness, a right transcribed into terms of competence brought to bear on an ignorance, of good sense, access to reality, correcting errors, delusions, hallucinations, fantasies, of normality, imposing itself on disorder and deviance. It is this threefold power that constituted madness as an object of possible knowledge for a medical science, that constituted it as an illness, at the very moment when the subject, stricken with this illness, found himself disqualified as insane, which is to say, stripped of any power and any knowledge concerning his illness. We know enough about your suffering and your special condition, things you have no inkling of, to recognise that it is a disease. But we are familiar enough with this disease to know that you can't exercise any right over it or with respect to it. This game, involving a power relation that gives rise to a knowledge, which in return founds the rights of the power in question, characterises classical psychiatry."
You can see where that comes in like the context of autism. You go and see an expert. They just account all of this crazy bias based on like very outdated research. It's happened to me. Just not really understanding, taking on board your experiences and as a human being, communicating what your experiences are, what works, what doesn't, how you actually see things, what you actually struggle with, the things that you do want to change about itself, the things that you don't. Those are all things that can be discounted by some people because they see you as they see you as defective, basically, and they know better because you can't know about yourself. That does happen with autism. It does.
Essentially saying that psychiatry works on the premise that patients' conditions mark them as less than human, and thus gives psychiatrists the ultimate authority over patients as an object of study. That doesn't exactly sound like progressing. It sounds like a framework that, while possibly leading to effective ways of making people productive members of society, doesn't exactly care about the systemic violence involved in that process, or even the ways that patient subjectivity and perspective can, in many cases, work in collaboration with psychiatric expertise. If you take something away from this outline of the history and philosophy of modern psychiatry, take away the idea that mental illness, disability, and disorder are all culturally determined. Knowledges about these conditions are produced in ways that exclude disabled or neurodivergent people from the production of expertise on their own experience. If we can only access reality through social concepts, then that means the construction of reality should probably have some kind of democratic element to it. Psychiatrists aren't the only ones with a stake in reality. Psychiatrists, psychologists, and other experts in the human sciences aren't an evil cabal that want to maintain their absolute power. But the production of human scientific knowledge is a socially conditioned process of production. We all grew up believing in modern knowledge assumptions, and I can understand why it might be difficult to completely abandon that form of reasoning. These assumptions are so difficult to break from because they hold so much power. The ideas I've discussed here might sound like something a millennial grad school dropout posts on Twitter, but they're important. You may not agree with them, but there are entire disciplines that do amazing things with the idea of a socially constructed reality. Because of the work of disabled and neurodivergent activists who leverage critical social theory and people like Foucault who give institutional legitimacy to critical knowledge, it's becoming more common for even scholars within psychiatry and psychology to contest institutional knowledge. If psychiatric knowledge is as socially contingent and unfixed as I've just claimed it is, as people have been claiming for hundreds of years, then there are serious conflicts and contradictions within psychiatry that need to be resolved. A 2017 article in the Journal of Disability Studies documents the fact...
Just like going... perhaps more into biology and perhaps a little bit into psychology. Talking on like the aspects of antidepressants, like the usual way that people go about finding drugs to help with particular mental illnesses like depression would be to first find a target, a reason to why someone is struggling with depression, perhaps, and then finding something to help balance that or mitigate the symptoms that they're having. The thing about antidepressants is that they found out that serotonin was important in depression first by giving it to rodent models, I think rabbits or something, and it showed to it had some positive effect on them, and so they tried it in humans. see what effects it had on them, see if it had a similar effect, and it did, which was to stabilize mood. So science is not always this straight narrow line, and some things that we learn and the ways that we do science is built on something that we don't particularly understand, and that can be said for a lot of like psychiatric drugs. So facts, things like that, they're not always constructed in the way that you think that they are. Sure, antidepressants do help. I take them daily. helps me stabilize my mood, stop me from having such bad dips. Does get rid of some of the more happy, positive effects of life and enjoying things, but stops me from getting too bad that I become like a danger to myself, basically. So it's very much it's dependent. This idea of facts and legitimacy of certain things. It's always a gray area, and it varies very widely discipline to discipline.
That the legitimacy of psychiatric knowledge is still an active and inconclusive discussion.
Each edition of the DSM has been influenced by the epistemological beliefs of the writers and editors. All editions have had the intent to ensure appropriate and consistent labeling of people with mental health disorders. However, the DSM is controversial even among mental health professionals. Scholars tend to agree the categories are subjective and risk either including everyone or leaving out children with behavior differences that do not come with a label.
If
Exactly.
not even psychiatrists agree on things that are supposed to give diagnosis validity and legitimacy, then has diagnosis ever carried as much validity and legitimacy as we think it does? But surely, things like autism are firm structures we can observe in the brain. Autism has concretely studied mechanisms and consistently defined patterns. Well, let's give autism another look. What kind of behaviors do psychologists look for when diagnosing autism? I'm sure they're
Three
super
things.
objective and
Triad
exist
of
totally
impairments.
independently of social norms. Luckily, us self-diagnosers carry copies of the DSM-5 like a Bible. So let's open her up. Oh wow, autism spectrum disorder has its own section. We made it to the top, baby. Okay, here we go. So
Interesting tidbit here. I actually took the autism spectrum quotient test online. I showed very minimal signs of being autistic in adulthood. Definitely autistic, diagnosed when I was a kid. Very obviously autistic all throughout most of my life. Up until this point, because I've kind of worked on certain areas of the way that I communicate, I've worked on understanding my emotional side a little bit more. Something that I struggled with due to alexithymia. So it's an interesting point there. I think there's some people in my life who have scored higher on that, who aren't diagnosed autistic, that they scored higher than me. So it's there's still a lot more to learn about it.
need
Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, as manifested by the following, currently or by history. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation, to reduced sharing of
Subjective.
interests, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions.
Yeah, that actually sounds really objective. It doesn't. What does it mean to have a deficit in social communication? What is an abnormal social approach? What does it mean to have behavior adjusted to suit various social contexts? Can I find an abnormal social approach written on the brain? Is it given to you when you make a Reddit account? Is it written in the stars? How we define abnormal social approach is, well, social, cultural. Foucault noted this quite well. What might be considered knowledge in one age might be considered deviant in another. And I think even the DSM-5 acknowledges that fact.
Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships should be judged against norms for age, gender, and culture.
Oh, so what you're saying is that these crucial diagnostic factors are contingent on the norms we currently have in place. That people can only be diagnosed as autistic when you take into account social norms. That's starting to sound, oh God, socially constructed. The DSM tells psychiatrists to look out for the abnormal, but the abnormal has to refer to a norm within a cultural context. Even the DSM-5 seems to imply that there are some cultures and contexts in which autistic traits are considered an abnormal disorder, and other contexts where that isn't the case.
100%. Really, really good point there. Abnormal. It's subjective. It's a subjective thing. It's not an objective. You can't just say something is objectively I suppose okay. I'm getting too much into the words, but it's totally it is very much based on the things around you, your environment. And also, interesting fact about social communication. They did some studies on it. There was one study that I read. They compared 3 groups of people. One was autistic group, one was a holistic group, neurotypical, if you want to call them, and one was a mix. They all got them to perform a social group activity, to achieve a certain task. Both the autistic and neurotypical groups performed almost equally well on that task in terms of their social cohesion. In the mixed group, not so much. Interesting thing there, it's dependent on who you are around. Let's continue.
But surely autism isn't just a collection of traits. Surely there's something in the autistic brain that unites every person with a diagnosis. Surely there's some fundamental difference, right? Or else, how can we consider autism to be a neurodevelopmental disorder if order isn't tied to the brain but to social context? Well, we kind of don't know what autism is. There isn't one thing that all autistic people have in common. There isn't any one brain marker, or any one gene, or one experience. Autism is a collection of behaviors and experiences that institutions decided to label disordered. And if you investigate other mental conditions, you'll start to notice similar things. A lot of what connects neurodivergence isn't actually a firm, material, neuroscientific boundary, but a socially determined and politically contested list.
However, in contrast with many other disorders of the brain, for example, neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's diseases, autism lacks any clear unifying pathology at the molecular, cellular, or system levels.
And you could sure as hell bet that there are critical autistic scholars and critical autism studies that reject this idea that autism is a natural kind or an existing thing that is waiting to be found. As critical autistic scholar Larry Arnold puts it,
I do not, however, assume that autism or any other currently described category of disorder is a natural kind. On the contrary, I assume that the description and social situation of autism, and by extension other disorders, is a construction born out of a constellation of neurological traits that have come to the fore and been labeled in this way for historical reasons.
For Arnold, autism is like, I've been arguing, a social construct. This isn't to say that autism isn't real or has no basis in reality, but that it's a category that attempts to organize a very complicated reality into a single label. Not every scholar of autism holds this view. There are people who have tried to theorize autism as having one unifying trait. For example, Simon Baron-Cohen, alongside colleagues Alan M. Leslie and Ultra Frith, argue that people with autism are united in the fact that they do not have or have difficulty with theory of mind. For those unfamiliar, a theory of mind is the ability to understand what's going on in the minds of other people. Famous advocates of this theory, like Baron-Cohen, argue that autistic people just have no clue what's going on in the minds of the people they socialize with. Well, according to the scientific literature, the theory of mind sucks shit. The theory of mid doesn't have much empirical support. From one small study of 20 autistic children in the 1980s, Baron-Cohen spawned a gargantuan theory that promised to identify the unique, defining trait of autism. In the process, these researchers continuously reinforced the idea that theory of mind was an essential aspect of humanness and humanity, and that autistic people lack humanity. Several studies have tried to replicate the original theory.
I have talked to Simon Baron-Cohen on the podcast, actually. It's definitely apparent to me that we do tend to struggle somewhat with understanding the perspectives of neurotypical individuals, but you could say vice versa as well. You know, it's still based on that norm. There was a test, I think, that they use for theory of mind, which is basically the idea of it is it's a question. So it's like you have two kids playing, Tom and Sam. His brother's called Sam. So Tom goes out the room while Sam jeez, butchering this so much. They're playing with the ball, basically. They take it out of the cupboard, they play with the ball, and then Tom goes out the room, Sam's still playing with the ball, and then he puts it, and then Tom comes back, Sam puts it in the cupboard, Tom goes out the room. Oh my god. Oh, terrible, butchering it so much. Oh my god, you can tell I'm a bit tired. Right. The idea of it is Sam puts it away in the cupboard. But Thomas doesn't know that it's it's not in the cupboard. And then the person asks you, where does Thomas look? And if you're autistic, you would say the cupboard, the basket or something that Sam put the ball away in. But because you lack theory of mind, you would say the cupboard because he put it in the cupboard, rather than the fact that Thomas's perception is different. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this. I hope it's coming across to some degree. I'm still not sure on it. I mean, I can definitely see that in a lot of in terms of autism, like understanding it. You have other concepts that have come from Simon, which have been like adaptive versus cognitive empathy, which I think is quite important. Basically splits up empathy into cognitive and adaptive elements. Cognitive being your ability to act, your ability to like notice how someone is feeling without them telling you. Adaptive being acting appropriately. Autistic people, we don't lack adaptive empathy. Psychopaths do. But we often do lack the cognitive elements of it, and we have to learn it. But again, it's still in the context of a neurotypical society, because if there were oldest autistic people, it just wouldn't make any sense, you know. Tom has a spoon, Sam's thinking a spoon, who can touch the spoon? Yeah, Tom, I guess. Is that another one? Is that another, like, autism, like a theory of mind test? Because the first time that someone did that ball analogy with me, I did respond with, you know, it's in the cupboard, because it in my head I was like, okay, well, it's in the cupboard. I didn't think about Tom's perspective on the matter. I do think that the adaptive cognitive element of like empathy is important. Not too sure on the theory of mind aspect. I think it's very dependent on the people that are around you. I don't think that it's the one unifying thing about autism, though. I think that's a far reach. I don't think it's necessarily intended as being like lacking humanity either. I think it's just trying to figure out what autism is. I don't ascribe any like malicious intent.
Of mind study and other studies done by Baron Cohen, and guess what? Autistic people, yes, diagnosed autistic people, demonstrated that they did in fact have a theory of mind. And despite the lack of empirical support and the ways theory of mind dehumanizes autistic people, these ideas still hold institutional legitimacy. It doesn't hold that legitimacy because it's a proven fact. It was just a compelling theory that fit the paradigms of knowledge popular at the time. A paradigm in which autistic people and other people with mental conditions are seen as less than human. These psychiatrists will cling to theories that uphold psychiatric legitimacy, even if these theories blatantly demonstrate the ways the system will maintain its own unreason in the name of declaring others unreasonable. It's time to stop pretending like we have a firm scientific understanding of neurodivergent identities, and therefore the right to self-righteously gatekeep their meaning. These identities, like all identities, are socially contingent. That category holds a lot of power. It's a category that unites neurodivergent communities and allows people to get institutional support. The idea of social construction does not deny any of that. It only claims that these categories aren't things that we find in a pure natural form. The truth about autism isn't out there waiting to be discovered in its universality, because autism, neurodivergence, and mental conditions have no truth that exists independent of social life, culture, ideology, and power.
That which we call autism is contingent on time and era as a form of shifting discourse. That constellation of neurological traits has always existed in one form or another, but each of them has been the subject of different foci as to which are the most prominent in terms of what is being constructed as either impairment or maladjustment within a strictly limited context. This context is often invisible to the actors as they are immersed within it.
Very interesting way of approaching it. I would like to have a look at that study there, because I find that it's like in adulthood, it's something that, you know, given a bit more thought, I can see why, you know, it's, but I don't know, maybe it was done in kids, maybe it was done And it was just a bad study. I don't know. I need to look into that a bit more. Yeah, this video is throwing a lot of curveballs. I will definitely have to do some more research into that.
And despite this being demonstrated time and time again across all these different social categories, there's a part of me that wants to believe that institutions, including psychiatry, when practiced well, are the best thing we have. I mean, shouldn't we aim towards a democratically effective truth? But I'm also plagued by the knowledge that as long as humans use language to describe things, to make categories, and use each other to build these categories, reality will never not be socially constructed, socially limited. My intention in highlighting these ideas is not to say that one random person's word is just as good as any institution's, and that your TikTok feed is better than the DSM in identifying helpful mental health resources. But before we go around criticizing TikToks by upholding the authority of psychiatric knowledge in this uncritical light, in determining reality as we know it, we should be conscious of the ways that both a stupid TikTok and psychiatric knowledge have cultural baggage. I don't think these two cultural products are on level playing fields, but that's not because I think that mental illness is a real biological natural object waiting for some fart-smelling psychiatrist to discover them. If there's any reason I might be inclined to uphold the legitimacy of a psychiatric diagnosis, it would only be because I've seen people who have been helped through these labels and resources given to them by psychiatrists and therapists. At this point, any critical person might say, yeah, it seems that a lot of people feel better after psychiatric help, but is that because that was the only legitimate option presented? And what about the shit ton of people alienated by psychiatric institutions? Yeah, I hear that. I hear Foucault. I hear critical scholars. They're right. The psychiatric institution was not built for people like me. It wasn't built to humanize. As scholar Devin Price
And I think as well, like, it depends. It really does. Like, you can look for particular traits, like even account like particular diagnoses like schizophrenia, where you have hallucinations. I know some people who I've come across who are diagnosed schizophrenic and they have like auditory hallucinations. They're aware of that. It fits quite well with their experiences. That the signs of them are very well, you know, the symptoms of schizophrenia are definitely something that applies to them. You know, I think it really depends. Like, it's all a grey area, I feel, and autism is just a really, really big grey area. The brain itself is a very complicated organ. Personally, I think we still have to learn about it. 100%. Well, we don't even know what this idea of like consciousness is. You know, what does distinguish us from other creatures? Maybe nothing. Maybe there is some distinguishing thing. Who knows? Where is consciousness generated?
Autism has historically been studied in how it appears in young white boys. We have to live with the consequences of that.
Usually, it's white boys with conventionally masculine interests and hobbies that are flagged as potentially autistic when they are young. Even within that relatively privileged class, it's almost exclusively wealthy and upper middle class autistic kids who get identified. That group has always been the prototype for autism when it's described by clinicians or depicted in media. All the diagnostic criteria for autism are based on how it presents in this group. Every autistic person is hurt by this narrow conception of the disorder, even the white, rich, cisgender boys who are most likely to be reflected by it.
And that's not just a fact that you regurgitate in your social justice circle. It's a fact that, along with all the other biased conceptions of autism, has real implications for autistic people seeking diagnosis.
I've been looking for that diagnosis for years now. I finally found a center that provides everything you need for diagnosis. I saw a psychiatrist for the second time this week, expecting to start my assessment. But no, she apparently decided that I don't have autism based on our 2 sessions together. She said, and I quote, "I think you don't have autism because we can have a conversation with you, and you can respond to my questions."
After several questionnaires and meetings, the psychiatrist said, "It's very unlikely I'm autistic." I won't outright reject it, but his reasons given seem weak. I told him I struggle working out how other people feel, cognitive empathy, but I'm overly sensitive to emotion if I know how a person feels, affective empathy, and he said it's usually backwards. That autistic people can deduce how other people feel. They just don't care.
I told my therapist today, against my better judgment.
No, it's the opposite. What the heck? I think that person's thinking about psychopathy. Jesus.
That I was recently diagnosed with ASD. And what she said in response really bothered me. She told me I shouldn't call myself autistic and should say I'm on the spectrum because most autistic people never live outside of their parents' house.
Went to psychiatrists to know whether I have adult autism or not. And before she even listened, she said that autism is trendy now. 10 years ago, everyone had ADHD. Now, apparently, everyone thinks they have autism.
I'll say it. Maybe TikTok does encourage 12-year-olds to frivolously latch onto serious labels. What a novel concept. But if there's any real problem TikTok might be causing, it's the people being denied by therapists an evaluation because therapists believe that autism is trendy now. I reject this notion that people seeking professional evaluations are only self-diagnosed TikTokers or a part of the trend. Therapists should know better. And I don't see any reason why self-diagnosis as a concept should be seen with such disgust, annoyance, cringe. Is that it? Cringe? I've spent the better part of a decade wondering why I feel so cringe. Why do I feel so different? So alienated by my social uncertainty, so weirdly looked upon because of the way I enjoy things, so awkward about the way my body occupies space. If autism isn't a thing in the world or in the brain, if it's socially constructed, yet still a very real and very experienced category, then what if autism's ontology, or its being, is constituted by a relationship to power and knowledge? What if autism and other neurodivergence is a distinct relationship to our socially constructed reality? You might even say that it's a break with that reality. And autistic people form community around this unique relationship to power and knowledge. And so what if I resonate with that despite not having a diagnosis? I know myself. I know who I am. So you know what? Frick you. I know my own experience. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna get an autism diagnosis.
Here we go. Rabbit Dewey says I'm autistic in California but neurotypical in Florida. 40. Do I need to pay to be diagnosed with autism? I don't go to the doctor that often because I can't afford it. Is there a cheaper / free alternative? I would, if you're American, if you're outside of the UK, because UK has general healthcare, you'd probably have to wait about anywhere from 1 to 3 years for an autism diagnosis, which is stupid. You don't have to pay for it though. And a lot of people, even in the UK, will pay for a private diagnosis because it's quicker. You can do, and it's usually like, as this person in this video said, in the range of like 1,000 to 2,000, which is ridiculous. So it's pretty expensive to actually get one. Yeah, 1 to 2K is outrageous. It's ridiculous. Like, I decided to pay because I'm getting old. I can understand that. It can also be quite affirming for some people, but you do also have to be aware. It is very dependent on who's diagnosing you as well. And they can be biased one way or the other. And they can have certain different ideas of what autism is. They're not to the letter. And some of them that are to the letter, so much so that they don't recognize that because you can make eye contact that you could be autistic, or that you mask, or that is even a thing that happens. There's a lot of factors involved with that. I wish you best of luck with it, honestly. This is why self-diagnosis is such a thing. Because, if you've done your research and you feel like you are autistic and it's something that you've really solidly tried to delve into yourself and understand about yourself, who am I to like reject that? Like, you could be wrong, you could be right. It doesn't matter if you identify with the experiences that autistic people have and you share the traits, and just try and learn and live your life based on that. If you are looking for things systemically to support you, that's a whole different ballgame. And also with the diagnosis comes negatives like not being able to move to different countries, disclosing your diagnosis and getting rejected. Trace says, I'm in the UK, I've been signposted to the charity that does it for under £500 recognised by the NHS. All the research.
To whom it may concern. Alexander Avila came to the SAC Center for a diagnostic evaluation to assess if he meets criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD or any other psychological or emotional challenges. Based on the clinical interview and assessments given, it was determined that he does meet criteria for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. He has functional impairments in social emotional reciprocity, in nonverbal communication, and challenges developing, he has highly restricted fixated interests that are as well, he struggles with hyperreactivity and inflexible adherence to routines. These patterns of behavior have been present since he was a young age and became more apparent as he developed. They are not better explained by another mental or physical health condition. Regards, George Sachs, clinical psychologist and ASD and ADHD specialist.
Here it is. Written in black and white by a psychologist. It turns out I'm autistic. I'm autistic. I'm freaking autistic. I'm so fucking autistic, bro. I am autistic. I'm omega autistic. I'm autistic. I'm autistic. I'm autistic. I'm autistic. I know myself. I told you I know myself, right? I know myself. Right? Can you self-diagnose yourself if there is no self? It might sound like a question only the right amount of drugs can produce, but in fact, the question of the self was one of the principal preoccupations of 20th century Western philosophy. What is a self? Some people believe that the self is an internal essence, perhaps even an immaterial soul that gives our
This is getting very, it has been throughout, very philosophical and obviously sociological, which I imagine is where they come from in terms of background. We could have told him that. This is what I mean. It's like, self-diagnosis not valid. In some cases, yes, some cases not. But it's, if something helps you, a way of being helps you, a community helps you, then just be a part of it, If it just fits, and you read more than like watching a TikTok on it, which I don't assume that many people have just made that jump, which is what a lot of people outside of the community would say about self-diagnosis.
Experience a sense of coherent grounding, but we don't exactly have access to this self, or the tools to draw firm lines around what exactly constitutes the self. It's a concept we take for granted, especially when liberal societies constantly hold up self-expression as a type of freedom we should all strive for. But if you really think about it, what is it that you're expressing? In one of the most baller moves of the 20th century, certain strains of philosophy began to contest the idea that the self, or in philosophical terms, the subject, even exists in the way we think it does. It's too complicated to explain within the time frame I have, so I'll definitely do it anyways. All right. So this shit goes back to the 1600s, when this dude named Descartes popularized the idea that the self, or the subject, exists as a coherent thinking thing independent of everything else. After taking the wrong amount of drugs, Descartes came up with this thought experiment in which he had to radically doubt the existence of everything he couldn't prove. Well, that rules out the outside world. There's no way to prove that we aren't living in a simulation.
Yeah.
So he said, damn, I think, therefore I am. The only thing Descartes could prove was the fact that he existed as a thinking subject. And this idea of a thinking subject who perceives and thinks about objects proceeded to become the foundation of liberal philosophical thought. Libs began to define what it meant to be a subject. But as time went on, a bunch of alienated betas began to find issue with this whole subject business. Like, low-key, like, what if we're not coherent thinking subjects, disconnected from the world, but instead subjects that, like, kind of exist in the world, connected to the world? Not actually thinking that deeply or rationally? In fact, I haven't thought in years. Or what if subjectivity, that is, our experience of being a subject, isn't as coherent as we perceive it to be? What if there isn't one thinking subject, but a split between conscious and unconscious minds, where the unconscious mind governs our thoughts and behaviors in complex ways? What if language forces us to enter a symbolic world in which we can only conceive of ourselves symbolically and therefore are inherently alienated by the symbolic self-concept that could never fully represent what it's supposed to signify? What if pee and if not, poop? So we don't exactly know what it means to be a self. Is it really possible to draw firm boundaries?
You've got to make an assertion as a start point. I think that's the thing. It's like, I mean, this is going deep into like my headspace during my time at university. This is very much where I was, like, in my second year of uni, contemplating life. I very much got to the same conclusion about like thinking and stuff, trying to like prove things exist, and you get into a rabbit hole, and then you think like, well, if I'm having thoughts, how do I know that like I'm just a biological piece of matter? Like, am I a flawless thinker? Do thoughts mean anything? Nihilistic despair hits straight into an existential crisis.
Between ourself and the world? Probably not. Vsauce, Michael here, have you ever wondered where your thoughts come from? Are they your thoughts or society's thoughts? Like when we see a green light, we're conditioned by society to at least associate that green light with go. Or when we see another person, we're conditioned by society to judge that person based on a certain set of standards given to us by society. And if you think you have a unique set of standards or that you deviate from the norm, do you not judge your uniqueness in reference to those established norms? Otherwise, how do you know you're unique? Don't all our thoughts have to be articulated through language, which is an inherently social concept? Put together, this kind of implies that our thoughts can never really escape language and social meaning. We're not the rational, disconnected subject Descartes thinks that we therefore are. Is there any part of you that is wholly original? And if there isn't, then do you really exist? The favorite problematic bald man of unemployed sodomites, Michel Foucault, would argue that there really isn't a way to separate your selfhood from power. In Foucault's work, the self or the subject is an effect of power. Power sets the type of discourses dominant in a given society, and those discourses give cultural meaning to what it means to be a subject. This is the process of subjectivation, or subjectification, or subjection. It doesn't matter. For example, like institutions will discuss things like what it means to be a criminal. And through this process of subjectification, people who fit these cultural ideas of criminality then become criminal subjects in the eyes of society. People labeled criminal subjects are perceived by the world as criminal subjects, and they perceive what it feels like to be a criminal subject. Society creates subjects and the experience of what it feels like to occupy that subject position. That experience is called subjectivity. Society creates subjects, and it creates the subjectivity. Society gives meaning to categories like man or homosexual or student or middle class, then it creates the subjective experience, the subjectivity of living in these categories. And
I think one thing that Alexander is missing is biology. You know, I'm very much quite a hot take. I don't believe in free will. I believe that we're all just products of our environment and our biology. I think Alexander is describing the environmental aspect of it. I think there are definitely totally biological impacts. Just to do a bit of an explanation, because I can imagine that people might be like, "What? You don't believe in free will?" It's because I don't believe in a divine intervention. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in some supernatural thing. Doesn't mean that I don't act in the world as if people have free will and that I have free will, because you kind of have to function, and to have critical judgment and dictate your actions. But no, I don't particularly believe in free will. Yeah, no, I get what you mean, but it's categorized based on the idea of the environment, society. But I do think that you can have biological influences when it comes to all of those categories that he was talking about. I hope it makes somewhat sense. I'm not arguing that the categorization of autism is not social, because it is, but perhaps I don't know, there might be a biological element to it, but you have to categorize something in the first place, I suppose, to know what something is. This is not the video that I thought it was going to be. It's got too deep. It's too psychological, too philosophical. Oh my God. It's great though. I'm enjoying it.
Insidious part of this process, the reason why Foucault found this so pernicious, is in how society tries to hide the ways in which subjectivity and subjecthood is a social and historical process. We start to believe in these subjectivities. We may even believe that certain subjects are universal givens or natural products. We start to believe that some people are born criminals, that poor people will always be poor, that gay people will always be annoying, and that students are best taught when they're obedient, and that men and women are born with essentially different characteristics and essences. We create sciences and knowledges that justify the beliefs we have about subjects and subject positions. We become socialized into our own subjectivities and lose sight of the way our subjectivities are constructed by society in complicated ways. All our different subject positions intersect in ways that give us a sense of selfhood. Society gives us a language from which to understand and locate how our experiences fit into a social web.
I guess so. I mean, in a broader sense, not speaking in the context of autism, there is definitely for me myself, I've never been all that fond of just social norms that people have just told me that that's how things go. It never has been a convincing argument for me. If something makes sense to me, then it makes sense. Obviously when it comes to things like the law, it's something that you just gotta go by. If you're living in a country where those are the laws, or certain behavioral things are considered to be wildly inappropriate, then I tend to ignore those things. But I think that there is, from what I've experienced, it does seem like a lot of autistic people that I talk to, they need to understand exactly why and what and where does something come from. No, I understand what you mean, Mia. I think that my idea of free will is having some external force which allows you to enact direction in your life just solely out of you as a conscious being. Whereas I would argue that, there is, I guess it's more of a predestined kind of path, I guess, in a sense, because I don't believe in having that intervention into, it's one of the reasons, actually, my lack of belief in free will is one of the reasons that I have compassion for people, even if they're bad to me, or even if they are ignorant, or, the worst kinds of people. I think there's always a baseline level of okay, you're a brain, and you've been in a bad environment, and that mix of your brain in that environment has produced something not particularly favorable to me. You know, it's a little bit detaching, perhaps a little bit dehumanizing, I guess, way of thinking about it, but it works for me. I think when you say free will, I think you mean in the context of like decisions that you can make as an entity. It's a different definition, but I see what you mean. Yeah, you could characterize free will as the ability to make decisions, and you can't really dispute people having decisions. Depends what like level you're looking at it on. It's very difficult for me to explain. I'm not a philosopher, but I have thought about this stuff myself quite a bit.
But the language we use to describe ourselves is never really ours. The self, or the subject, only comes into being when power organizes our social language into intelligible subject positions. When Foucault wrote Madness and Civilization, his intention was not just to show the social construction of mental conditions, he also wanted to demonstrate that psychiatric institutions have the power to define how we understand our mental experiences, and that we, as subjects, are forced to believe in that reality of psychiatric language. Psychiatric institutions give us a historically specific language about what it calls mental illness. And you
have to play by their rules. You have to play by the rules of the game in order to engage with the game. It makes sense.
As subjects, accept that language. Okay, so neurodivergence. Society makes us into subjects and defines the ways subjects can be understood. The consequences of this for those with mental conditions is in how we become defined by the labels put upon us. People are socialized to understand neurodivergent subjects through biomedical discourses because that's the way psychiatry frames neurodivergence. As neurodivergent writer Remy Urgio explains,
I mean to suggest that mental disability always leaves something behind, and in leaving something behind, mental disability takes over. When one is schizophrenic, for example, her rhetorical actions are rendered as less symbolic actions and more as biological motions. Schizophrenia causes the person to act. The schizophrenic person in these constructions has no volition, or whatever volition she has is tempered by the schizophrenia. In this regard, it's important to note that whatever the placeholder, whether schizophrenia, autism, depression,
This screen is like setting my sensory stuff off a little bit. It's very, very aesthetic, but it's not friendly to mine eyes. We don't have a self. Well, I mean, it depends what you define as self. I think that's the point of it. It's like, it's going very, very in-depth on philosophically, which I enjoy. Like, I enjoy philosophy. I do get it. It's trying to explain things from like a sociological, philosophical angle, which I think is worthwhile thinking about. I don't know how applicable it is in it, other than saying like, okay, maybe the way that we view psychology is bias, and we set the rules ourselves, and yeah, we do. And we set the categories ourselves, yeah, we do. And they're based on the norms, yes, they are. I think that's what you can pull from this, I believe.
cerebral palsy, ADHD, bipolar. Mental disability signals a kind of rhetorical involuntariness. Mental disability wields more agency than mentally disabled people.
Mental illness, that is, the construction of mental illness, speaks louder than the person because all of the language we have to express ourselves is created by others. If all language is social and power dynamics control the social, then all the language we have to describe ourselves and others is an effect of power.
That's why reframing is so powerful. I love reframing so much. The social model of disability. Look it up. I'm thinking of it as our ability to make decisions. I understand from that standpoint. I could go into it, I guess. It would basically just be a very long ramble. Probably be good to talk about to somebody. I did do a podcast on autism and spirituality with quite a like a filmmaker, an autistic filmmaker. Very interesting person. Highly recommend that podcast if you are interested in my views on philosophy and all that. but maybe not for now, because it might be an even longer video.
Presents us with a bit of a hairy pickle. The great predicament of selfhood. We as humans need language to experience existence, to understand and to communicate, but language fundamentally alienates us because it can never capture the entirety of existence. Famous SJW Judith Butler expands on the sorrowful psychic experience of subjecthood in their book, The Psychic Life of Power.
How is it that the subject is the kind of being who can be exploited, who is, by virtue of its own formation, vulnerable to subjugation? Bound to seek recognition of its own existence in categories, terms, and names that are not of its own making, the subject seeks the sign of its own existence outside itself, in a discourse that is at once dominant and indifferent. Social categories signify subordination and existence at once. In other words, within subjection, the price of existence is subordination. Precisely at the moment in which choice is impossible, the subject pursues subordination as the promise of existence.
We're all born living these unique narratives of existence. We have these unique ways of being and biographies that reflect how our beings develop over time. Society takes these unique experiences, categorizes them, defines them, and gives them a history and social meaning. And knowing your identity has a history can be a powerful thing. It's something we long for, but we end up having to understand ourselves and these narratives in ways power defines.
What autism provided was a discursive framework, a lens through which others could story my life. My hand and full body movements became self-stimulatory behaviors. My years-long obsession with maps and the Electric Light Orchestra became perservations. My repetition of lines from the movie Airplane became echolalia. My very being became a story, a text in dire need of professional analysis. This, my body, this was autism. And suddenly, with the neuropsychologist's signature on my diagnostic papers, I was no longer my body's author.
We're born into these histories and cling on to labels that we feel describe who we are. And through this clinging, the distinction between the label and our self disappears as if it never existed. These subject positions are powerful. In the case of autism, the autistic label is backed by the legitimacy of the psychiatric institution. And to a lot of people, that legitimacy gives our experiences a concrete realness. Finally, there's a name for my suffering, a name for my unique joys. My world has become intelligible. So it makes sense why people have negative reactions to self-diagnosis. If these institutions give our experiences legitimacy, if they constitute the foundation of our subjective experience, of course we're going to instinctively defend those institutions. But as philosophers and sociologists keep uncovering again and again, these subject positions aren't written into the fabric of the universe, into your brain or your genes. These subject positions don't describe anything except a way for society to understand how your body's autobiography fits into a larger history. Sure, these subject positions describe real behaviors and real experiences, but these real things become categorized and are given a position in a web we call social structure. We socially define what that structural position is. If subjectivity is an effect of power, if the self is created by relations of power, then the struggle to control the self and subjectivity is a political struggle. Subject positions are politically defined. Autism as a subject position is a politically defined construct. Just look at the ways neurodivergent and disabled activists seek to control, unfix, and destabilize how the neurodivergent and disabled subject is defined by society. Autism as a subject position is not a biological structure or a natural thing. Like all subject positions, autism is a relationship to the social world. And if you resonate with the autistic relationship to the world, you probably know. If you're neurodivergent, you know pretty early on that you, well, diverge. Psychiatry tries to take this experience, pathologize it, and dehumanize those who experience it.
I think that's possibly one of the ways where, the message I think that Alexander is putting across doesn't particularly resonate with me, because I don't necessarily see things wholly through the lens of psychiatry. I'm one of the actually autistic people. I do like to challenge things and reframe things, and so I kind of do that anyway. So maybe it's just not having as much of an impact on me and how I'm thinking about it. But I can see, if someone came across this and they were not part of the autism world, and they believe very wholly in the almighty significance of psychiatry all the time and didn't give it really a second thought and think about what it actually means, then I can imagine that this probably has a lot of impact. Valerie says, good evening from Quebec, Canada. Hello, Valerie. How are you doing? My lovely member. Oh, by the way, guys, if you have enjoyed this and you want me to continue streaming and doing this kind of thing, you can support me for as little as 99p or 99 cents in the member area. There's no additional benefits, but it does help encourage me to do more of these. And if you are watching this post, make sure to subscribe and like and do all of that stuff because it really helps.
It tries to correct this so-called
Let's get
disorder.
through it, guys.
But if you're like me, and your goal is to ensure that society is inclusive such that we're all given the opportunity to live a good life, then is this really the best way to understand neurodivergence as an innocent animality that only psychiatric institutions can understand and correct? There's a growing movement of politically engaged neurodivergent people who want to challenge psychiatric power. They see autism as the way I described it, as a unique relationship to the social world. It's a unique relationship to the social world that itself challenges the standards set up by a neurotypical society. And in that sense, autism is the site of a political struggle. How useful is it to pathologize and instrumentally regulate the site of a political struggle? Do we not all have a right to access alternative tools for self-expression if we need them? Because to pathologize that need and that right would be to continue to perpetuate the project of subjection and psychiatric power.
I think one thing that needs to be delved into a bit more, it's things related to like objective dysfunction. Like for me, I really struggle with executive functioning. I do have meltdowns, I do have shutdowns, I do get overloads. I don't know any person who isn't autistic who has the similar experience to me in that sense, but I do know autistic people who, many autistic people who share that experience. So it's interesting to, again, tying in the biological aspect of this, when we classify things as, you know, it might be in the context, when we're talking about social things, it might be a bit more complicated, but is some parts of it biological? I would argue probably yes. And that's like, you know, obviously you need to categorize it, as they said, but it's still, it's something, you know. And if it is tied to an actual change in the brain, change in genes, then I feel like that would make it a bit more concrete and not solely a social thing. But we don't know. We don't know at what extent the disability that we might experience is caused by an unfavorable environment versus just a natural inherent difficulty. Just want to tie in the biology there.
So you know what? Here's my letter. Here's my diagnosis. This is what I think of it. I can't. I know why labels exist. Labels and categories make it really easy to find community and access accommodations. Institutions, as evil as Foucault claims them to be, often use their power to help people attain the resources they need. And how do you identify who needs resources? Yeah, a label probably helps. It's not my intention to discredit those who have been helped by psychiatry or who find comfort in the labels that society gives us. But I think it wouldn't hurt to also reflect on the histories and the underlying assumptions that sustain the institutions we move through. When people discount self-diagnosis, is it actually out of a concern for neurodivergent people or mental health? No. Or is there an underlying uncritical belief in the ultimate authority of the non-neurodivergent to create the truth about the neurodivergent? No, Alex, you don't get it. These fake self-diagnosers take away resources from real autistic people. But is it actually self-diagnosers taking away resources? Because last I checked, these resources are distributed by institutions, not people with self-diagnosed mental conditions. Sometimes I get the vibe that some neurodivergent people have a negative reaction to self-diagnosis because of this "they haven't suffered like I have" mentality.
100%, 100%. I can see why that happens. It's a comparative thing. It's some people see it as a negative thing, and they bond with others based on those negative things, and not every single person has wholly negative experiences being autistic and things like that, but it's self-diagnosis kind of feels like a threat to someone's identity if they feel anybody can latch onto it if they want to. I can see why. The thing is, I do classify myself as an autistic person because I like it, and I think it fits me, and I do accept those societal ideas and definitions of what makes me autistic. I'm happy with that. I'm also not like, it's not all me. It's an aspect of me. I'm not the same as every single autistic person, is what we always say, so it's, every autistic person is different. And I am self-admittedly different to other autistic people. It's just a fact. And everyone is from each other. It's been a very complex video, but it's definitely thrown some curveballs and some interesting talking points. So let's finish it up, and then we'll round up with some conclusive points.
But two things. First, we don't have to understand autism purely through negativity. Autism provides a unique way of viewing the world that doesn't have to be interpreted through a totally negative lens.
And is
beneficial. Maybe I've gotten a kidney stone or two
sometimes
from neglecting basic bodily functions while focusing on a project, but I also kind of ate that shit up. Second, I can assure you that social alienation and suffering is one of the biggest factors which drives self-diagnosed people to seek a label. The majority of self-diagnosed people aren't seeking a trendy identity. And if they are, maybe they're 12. Why are you fighting?
Most people seek identity out of crisis. It is. Something goes wholly wrong, your world crumbles, you try and find what the solution is, and sometimes you find that you're autistic. And the ways of looking at the world and the ways that the understandings of the ways that you're different helps, like, massively. It's a great thing.
With a 12-year-old. I don't claim to speak for all autistic or neurodivergent people or people with mental conditions or disabilities. And there's plenty of people who have been helped by psychiatric methods. My own anxiety disorder was treated in a clinical setting. You know what? It helped. This piece of paper gets people accommodations. Disabled people rely on diagnoses to get government benefits and necessary assistance. I thought of the ways that I could destroy this letter. That'll show them, huh? But this paper describes my relationship to an institution, and I can't destroy that history. I shouldn't. Maybe I don't want to. Is it because I, like the people I criticize, also cling to language I didn't create? Because if I rip this letter, is my claim to legitimacy and realness gone? If, as Judith Butler says, the price of existence is subjection, then will I also be destroyed alongside this piece of paper? I don't know.
If you'd like to support my work, please visit patreon.com/aretheygay and consider pledging as little as $1 to help keep the channel running. Special thanks to my patrons: Aaron Seiler, Adeline Grubb, Aiden Iftikhar, Allison, All Pizzas Are Personal, Anna Midkiff, Autumn Moore, Avery, Avi, Barbie V, Batia Rabin, Brad the Great, Brandon Uzumaki, Catboy Girl, Charles Hero, Charlie Antonikakis, Chester Snap, Cobalt Pink, Colin Coltrera, Colin Unger Leader, Cooper,
How's it going?
Cybus, Dane Much, Danny Chalice, Daisy Granados, Don Hopkins, Draenix, Dropout Ninja, Henley, Mel, Rosamore here, Valerie Astra, Venom Titties, Wen, Wainoa, Ren Martin, your mom.
Well, people, that has been an experience and a half. Was not expecting that. That is awesome. Really great video to watch, and also touches on some really interesting sociological, philosophical, psychological things to do with autism that I was not expecting, but I gladly welcome. And I genuinely really enjoyed that. So I recommend, if you have watched through and you did like this, please go over to Alexander Avila. Go onto the video, give it a like, even if that's only what you do. Watch like 30 seconds so it counts as a view or something. Because what I do, the amount of effort that goes into doing these streams and commentating on them, it never quite reaches the level of effort and planning and time that's gone into creating these types of videos. So go check it out. TikTok Gave Me Autism, the politics of self-diagnosis. And yeah, definitely some good talking points. I do feel like there is definitely a biological angle and some things that need to be researched a bit more about autism. I do believe that there is that, although autism can be is categorized socially, I do also think there are some possible things that could be inherent and could be biological to autism. We don't know at the moment. But some great points there, and awesome. I mean, thank you to everybody who has stuck by till this point. We had probably about 10 people who's stuck by, so thank you so much. I'm probably gonna head to bed now. Have some sleeps. Take my meds if you haven't already. If it's evening for you, make sure to take your meds. Drink some water, all that stuff. And it's been a pleasure. See you later, guys.